on hand. So thank you everyone for participating in this afternoon's keynote presentation on financial exploitation in the 21st century, assessing risk and using investigation tools. We are so pleased to be joined by Peter Lichtenberg. He is the director of the Institute for Gerontology at the Merrill Skillman Institute. He's a professor of psychology at Western State University. He received his master and doctoral in clinical psychology from Purdue University. He completed his postdoctoral fellowship in geriatric neuropsychology at the University of Virginia Medical School, where he became a faculty member. A clinician and researcher throughout his career, Dr. Lichtenberg is was one of the first board certified clinical gero-psychologists in the nation, has made contributions to his practice of psychology across a variety of areas, including Alzheimer's disease, medical rehabilitation, and those suffering from late life depression. He is particularly interested in the area of intersection between financial capacity and financial exploitation, finding ways to balance autonomy and protection for older adults. He has created several person-centered financial decision-making and vulnerability scales, which he'll be talking about today. He's also authored 7 books and over 200 scientific articles in gero-psychology, including being a senior editor of the American Psychological Association's Handbook of Clinical Gero-Psychology. He serves as the 2022 president of the Gerontological Society of America.
Thank you so much, Rayanne. Let's get right to it. This is the overview for what I'd like to take you through today, to examine the domains of financial exploitation, to discuss the patterns of exploitation and some of the predictors, describe our research on person-centered financial exploitation vulnerability assessment and the financial vulnerability survey. I want to also introduce our financial decision-making screening tool and some of the work that we've done with Adult Protective Services here in Michigan and work in financial exploitation, and introduce our website, olderadultnestegg.com. Also, just lots of people to thank, lots of colleagues who have really been instrumental in this work moving forward, and lots of funders. And you can see even more colleagues as well. You know, finance and wealth play a huge role in our life across the life course, and particularly, though, in older age. This is a startling graph that really shows life expectancy from age 40, life expectancy, depending on whether you're in the 100th percentile of income, all the way down to the first. And we can see the gap between the wealthiest and poorest Americans, 10 years for women, 15 for men. So it has dramatic impacts on all parts of our life. It's not just about money. It's also about health and mental health. Let's define our terms. Financial exploitation, the misappropriation or misuse of the funds of an older and or vulnerable adult. So this includes fraud, family or friend exploitation, what's known as elder mistreatment, exploitation by staff or professionals. Ken Conrad and Mickey Iris developed this conceptual model of financial exploitation. I think it's very useful. The 6 domains. The most serious, of course, the theft and scams. That's how people actually take the money. They either steal it or they deceive somebody into giving it to them. But the next 3, abuse of trust, financial entitlement, and coercion, are the mechanisms by which many cases of financial exploitation take place. And we'll study these just a little bit more in depth. The last two, signs of possible financial exploitation and money management difficulties, are really risk factors. So let's take a look at abusive trust. What do I mean by that? Mr. D was a financial planner for an older woman. She was an immigrant. Her only family was her sister, who lived in Poland. Mr. D was her financial advisor for 20 plus years. She actually lived in an incredible apartment complex, condo complex, that was very tight knit, and many people were looking after her. But when she lost some of her independence and started to have some cognitive problems, she was forced to move to assisted living. That's when Mr. D swooped in, isolated her, poisoned the relationship she had with her former neighbors, pushed her sister aside, and had this woman change her estate plan to give Mr. D all of her assets upon her death. I just think that's a great example of abusive trust. Fortunately, he's paid the price in multiple ways. And that case of coercion and undue influence really started with this abusive trust. Financial entitlement. The most grievous example I've been involved with was an 85-year-old man. He had a serious illness, and his life was in jeopardy due to this illness. He was very weak after getting treatment. And even in medical rehabilitation, at first they weren't sure he was going to make it. But he did recover, and he went home, and he found that his home had been totally emptied out, and his car was sold by his son, who had the power of attorney. This gentleman had no cognitive issues, and once he regained his strength, he had no physical limitations. So I interviewed him and assessed him in his home with the one table he'd been just bought. But he later, of course, not only filled out his house, and car dealer was delighted to deliver a car to him, but he also cut his son out of his will. But this is financial entitlement. His son felt like, hey, my inheritance is my dad's money. I can do with it as I want now. Of course, you and I know that is theft. Undue influence, very pernicious. This younger neighbor, despite being out of touch with the older gentleman for over a decade. As a matter of fact, the reason they were out of touch was because he had borrowed some money from the older gentleman and had not paid it back. And so the older gentleman didn't have anything to do with him. But after this older adult suffered a very severe traumatic brain injury with a subdural hematoma and several infections, resulting in over 2 months of hospitalizations, the younger neighbor started to call him, started to poison his mind, because now this older gentleman had dementia, poisoned him against his sons, and he moved this gentleman into his home. And of course, you know the rest. He got the deed changed, he got the will changed. Now, fortunately, he lost totally in court and everything was reversed. But coercion, undue influence. Financial exploitation focus really emerged here in the United States in 2008 with this MetLife study. And the interesting thing about the MetLife study was it measured media coverage about financial exploitation of older people, not the incidence or prevalence. It also noted in 2010 that there was a 10% increase in media stories. And so that really launched when they did their estimate of $2.9 billion per year. People started to take financial exploitation more seriously. And the most recent Consumer Finance Protection Bureau report around the suspicious activity reports that they receive showed that trend to continue. Now, these reports are from financial institutions, whether they're deposit institutions or money services businesses that are wiring money, for example. These reports quadrupled between 2013 and 2017. And I think both because there are increasing cases of exploitation, suspicious activity, as well as much improved sensitivity to these cases and better detection. And these losses just in 2017 alone were $1.7 billion. And you can see here from the statistics that the majority were to older people. Almost 10% lost over $100,000. Now, interestingly, and this is changing with COVID, we know, but deposit institutions, primarily these were the perpetrators were people who knew the victim. Whereas in the money service businesses, these were stranger scams, romance scams, relative in need scams, lottery scams. But this stat right down at the bottom, the biggest losses occurred when a fiduciary went rogue. Now, a fiduciary is someone who is legally responsible for acting in the best interest of the older person. The average loss when a fiduciary started to dip into the older person's finances for their own gain was nearly $84,000. So how much financial exploitation is there? We don't really know the number, but in a self-report survey that Ron Asciano did, we know that this was second only to emotional abuse. Scott Beach found that 10% of older adults claim they've been victims of financial exploitation since age 60. And David Burns looked just at fraud, and his meta-analysis found another 5% of older adults each year were the victims of fraud. So roughly 10% of older people having some experience of financial exploitation each year, whether it's fraud or elder mistreatment. What were some of the predictors? Psychological factors such as depression, financial factors such as financial strain, and vulnerability factors such as a loss of independence in any of the IADLs or ADLs. Now, we had an opportunity to look at the prevalence and predictors of fraud in a national sample here in the United States. And what we found was a different combination of psychological vulnerability was the largest predictor. And that was not only high levels of depression, but also low levels of social needs fulfillment. In other words, these are people who are depressed and kind of invisible to the rest of society. Loss of status, loss of everyday confirmation. And when we did a longitudinal study, we took from baseline and people who had not been victims of fraud from the first study, followed everybody. We found that those who at baseline had this depression and low social needs fulfillment were more than twice as likely to be victims of fraud. But as you can see with the data, 4% in each sample, any of us can be the victim. Now, when we start to think about financial exploitation, we have to start thinking about a couple other things. We have to start thinking about financial decision-making, how people decide to engage with a scammer. We have to think about financial management, how people's financial skills impact their susceptibility. And we have to think about their cognition, and especially early memory loss. Our journey with this, our first major publication about financial decision-making was this person-centered approach to financial capacity assessment and development of a new rating scale. And this conceptual model right here is what's really driven all of our research on decision-making, but also, surprisingly, on financial exploitation. Those contextual factors, financial awareness, psychological vulnerability, and really relationship susceptibility impact those intellectual factors. These are choice, rationale, understanding, and appreciation. These are the things that are common to capacity standards. So let me show you what I mean by context or contextual variables. This was a normative study. Also, we got a experimental module in the Health and Retirement Survey sub-study, and we looked at the correlates of financial vulnerability. And these were our 6 questions that we were able to get into the sub-study. 65% of older people reported feeling anxious about financial decisions at least sometimes. This next one is very telling to us. Over half wish they had someone to talk to about their finances. And when people don't have someone to talk to, they may end up talking with a scammer or somebody who's going to exploit them. And also, almost a third reported being treated with less courtesy and respect during financial transactions. That's what I mean by context. That now, when we went back and studied financial exploitation, just by studying the contextual items from our scale, we found that context really matters. So we examined 34 items from our scale and compared a group of verified older people who had been financially exploited to a group that had not been exploited. And 17 items fell out. And those are now known on our website as the Financial Vulnerability Survey. And what this graph shows us is kind of highlighting again what I said in the beginning, that money is and financial exploitation issues are not just about money, it's also about health, mental health and physical health, and cognitive health. And we can see here that people who were exploited had poorer cognitive functioning than people who were not, a little bit less education as well. And you could see also, though, that in our original study, we had a very strong area under the curve analysis, and 7 or greater was a terrific cutoff score. And we continue to use that cut score in our studies. We cross-validated this as well. 6 or greater ended up being the best on all the indices, but you can see when you look at specificity, 7 or greater or 8 or greater really might be the best to use. And there's the scale. And I know you can all read this very clearly, but I wanted to just show it to you on one page to show you how simple it is. I will show each item. Before I do, I should say that AARP found our scale, and they said, you want to protect yourself from fraud? First, take a financial vulnerability survey. So we appreciated that. How worried are you about having enough money to pay for things? Overall, how satisfied are you with your finances? Who manages your money day to day? And how satisfied are you with this money management? How confident are you in making big financial decisions? How often do you worry about financial decisions you've recently made? Have you noticed any money taken from your bank account without your permission? How often do your monthly expenses exceed your regular monthly income? Those first 8 questions really get at issues related to financial stressors, financial strain, financial self-efficacy, and some financial experiences. The next set of questions are really about psychological vulnerability around finances. And the first one, how often do you talk or visit with others on a regular basis, gets at that issue of isolation and possibly loneliness. How often do you wish you had someone to talk to about your finances? How often do you feel anxious about them? Do you have a confidant? How often do you feel downhearted and blue about financial situation? Are your memory, thinking skills, or ability to reason with regard to finances worse than a year ago? And the final three items really have to do with relationship strain around money. Has a relationship with a family member or friend become strained due to finances as you've gotten older? Did anyone ever tell you that someone else wants to take your money? And how likely is it that anyone now wants to use your money without your permission? Let's take a look at that vulnerability scale in some research. We put this scale up on our website, and we looked at the first 200 or so individual, 240 who completed it. And we had a couple of introductory questions, how is your memory less reliable than a year ago, and do you live alone? And our data really were interesting, because those who lived alone and those who had memory complaints had significantly higher financial vulnerability scores than those who did not live alone or have memory complaints. And when we put them together, you could really see those who live alone with memory complaints had the highest by far financial vulnerability scores. Almost 60% were financially vulnerable, maybe even a little higher than that. And living alone by itself, though, did raise people's scores. But you could see that even the living alone group is below that cutoff of 7. But the memory complaint for the average score, that the memory complaint group who live alone was above it. And for professionals, we created this decision guides for professionals administering the survey. We have what we call critical items that you can follow up on as a way of better understanding what's going on with the individual. So you can link to our video and our online PDF version of the tool, and when you fill it out, you'll get a report with the score, some interpretation, and next steps. Just a little bit of further research that we've done on this vulnerability. We looked again at all kinds of financial measures along with our financial vulnerability survey, with those who had exploitation, those who did not, new sample. And what we found was interesting, that the scale for financial vulnerability and the Lusardi and Mitchell 3-item scale for financial literacy were both independent predictors of who was exploited. Interestingly, however, they did not relate to each other. So they seem to be very orthogonal or independent from one another. And we looked at the impact of financial coaching of older adult victims. And what we found here was at baseline, people again had a number of areas in which they differed: physical health, learning, and memory, trail making, executive functioning, social support, and perceived stress. But after baseline, those who were exploited had significantly lower anxiety and a trend for better executive functioning. So intervention, we hope, can make quite a difference in people's lives. Now I want to transition now to our financial decision tracker, which is a screening tool that gets at those intellectual aspects of financial decision making. Once again, I know you can read this very clearly, but I do want to show you it's a one-sheet rating scale. And you can see that the older person's answers go on the left side and the rater's answers go on the right. We've done a lot of publications on this and a lot of validation, reliability and validity, cross-validation. And we've also done some work on implementation. But let's take a look at what it is and how you would use it. Here's the questions, just the stems. What's the financial decision you're making? Was this your idea, or did somebody else suggest it or accompany you? What's the purpose of your decision? What's the primary financial goal? How will this decision impact you now and over time financially? How much financial risk is involved? How may someone else be negatively affected? Who benefits most from this financial decision? Does it change previous planned gifts or bequests to others? And to what extent did you talk with anyone? Now, here's what it looks like for the actual scale. There's a multiple choice component to it so that you're not just taking open-ended responses. So what's the decision somebody's made? Are they giving a gift? Are they making a purchase? Are they making some kind of investment? Are they doing some estate planning? Are they involved in a scam? How will this decision impact you financially now and over time? Improve your position, no impact, negative impact, or debt. This understanding question is really a good one. It's very penetrating. And also this appreciation question. How much risk is there to your financial well-being? Low or none, moderate risk, or high risk? Who benefits most from this financial decision? A grandmother who was going to buy a house for her unemployed grandson was talked out of it by social worker that was using this scale. And one of the reasons she was talked out of it was because when she was asked this question, who benefits most, she said she did, because it made her feel good. And as the social worker said to me, you know, Peter, I love your scale. Older people make their decisions. They know what they want to do, and they make it with their heart. So they know what they want to do, and they know why, but your scale makes them put their head into it. They have to know the impact that it's going to have and how it's going to impact their own position. And of course, this grandmother would have been legally responsible for all the payment on that house every month. And she couldn't afford to do that. It would have ruined her. What extent did you talk with anyone? We're just trying to get at some issues around autonomy. So you take a scale like this that you can get trained on and certified at olderadultnestegg.com. But how do you implement it across a big setting? So how do you implement it across Adult Protective Services here in Michigan? And we tried to do an implementation science study of this. The implementation examines the translation of evidence-based practices into widespread usage, because these widespread usages are not typically governed by rationality. I really like that. You know, here's a great scale. Let's use it. Well, that's not what happens. You know, there's a lot of other things that go into it. If it was straightforward and rational, all you'd have to do is publish your scale, make sure people knew about it, and then everybody would start using it if it was that good. So we used the Paris framework, which actually was a health implementation science framework that's used still a lot, quite a bit. Has 3 basic elements. I like it because it's fairly simple, and that's how I think, very simply. Evidence. So what's the research quality and support? So I showed you all our publications. We had a lot of empirical support. These next two, what's the context? What environmental factors support implementation or not? And facilitation. How is it facilitated and by whom? And one key, of course, was our website, which we've mentioned before. But on our website, we have narrated, self-paced training and certification. So hundreds of people could get trained fairly quickly. There were four major elements related to context. And one was the APS sector supervisors, the structure of how APS is set up in Michigan. It's not just by each individual county, but it has 5 major sections. And these sector supervisors were important, and their support was really special and provided fertile ground for implementation. There also was an overall APS liaison assigned to expand the implementation of our scale. That person had access to both the senior management of APS in Michigan, as well as the sector supervisors and others. And of course, the website, training and certification, and the audit completed prior to the creation of the tool had indicated a lack of risk scoring tools. So there was a real push factor in terms of context about why they wanted to adopt these. So there are a lot of tools, risk tools like this in CPS, Child Protective Services, but very few in adult protective services, and especially around financial decision-making, capacity, exploitation. But what were the elements for facilitation? Well, I did a lot of traveling around the state and provided 2 trainings to each sector. But I also was able to review all the cases and clarify with the APS workers and supervisors for cases that might not have been administered correctly, or cases that I wanted further information on. The commitment of sector supervisors was critical. We also had a large feedback session organized by the APS liaison, and we made some new tools based on that. We created a decision tree and a user's guide based on that. The certification process was integrated into onboarding for new APS workers. And we had some refresher cases and case studies, especially ones that saved as much as $2 million. And those were all terrific facilitators of using it. Here is our website. And so this part, landing page for professionals, is where all of the APS workers went on. They listened to the overview, and then they got trained on the tracker and the family and friends interview. And now available is training on the financial vulnerability survey. What did we find? So this is over 800 cases. And we found, roughly 40% had some decision-making deficits. What were the decisions that people were making? And it fell out into 5 areas. People were either giving a gift, making a purchase, part of a scam, allowing someone else access to their money, or allowing someone else to take over their money. There was a high rate of agreement. Once you get done with entering the data on the survey, the risk score that is calculated by the computer algorithm comes up and shows you no concerns, some concerns, or major concerns, but it's the rater that makes the final decision. And you can see that over 90% of the time, the rater agreed with the decision of the algorithm. And literally only 3% of the time, or 4% of the time, did they increase the risk. So 96% of the time it was right on target, or they decrease the risk. All the questions, interestingly enough, distinguished in different study between those who had concerns and those who had no concerns in terms of deficits in decision making. But the ones that have the strongest, what we call effect sizes, the strongest impact were, how will this decision impact you now and over time? How much risk is there to your financial well-being? And who benefits most? So these are great questions. Even if you're not going to use the scale, these questions can be really helpful in discussing with an older person the transaction they are thinking of or involved in. Well, now what do I do? So this is what we created based on the feedback that we got from the APS workers. Just a little sheet that says, how do you use the results? And what do you do with them? Even some alternate phrasing for those who didn't understand the language that we had used initially. And you can see that we also kind of put in, well, which part was choice, which was understanding, which was rationale, and which is appreciation, the 4 elements of informed decision-making. And one more tool, the family and friends interview, or the informant report. And we not only created this tool, we also validated it as well on 150 informants. The first 4 questions are about decision-making factors of the older person. What decision were they making or thinking of making? Was it their idea? How would it impact them over time financially? How much risk is there? And the next questions are really about vulnerability. This one is an interesting one. Is your relative or friend helping anyone financially on a regular basis? This is often something that needs to be followed up on in older people, because even if they start out helping someone, they may have increased it without realizing it, and now they can't afford it. Or they may not feel assertive enough to stop it, even though they want to. Does your relative or friend regret or worry about financial decisions they recently made? That's another great question to put in your bag of tricks for questions, because even if you don't use a scale, that one gets at things that people are kind of ruminating about. And that often is, there's a larger story behind that. Would others who know your relative or friend well say the current decision is unusual for them? And how much does a relative or friend come to rely on just one person for all financial decisions? That's that confidential relationship issue. So an APS worker was assigned to work with an older gentleman who had befriended a woman about 35 years younger than he. She and her girlfriend both moved into the home, and the family was concerned about financial exploitation. The key to these scales is always in the person using them. The questions are just questions, but how you use them strategically and interpret the information is the key. And what this APS worker did, sensing that there might be some resistance, is he first used the family and friends interview with the 2 daughters who were making the complaint. So he got a sense of what they were worried about. And then when he knocked on the door, he asked the young woman who was living there, I'm really depending on you to give me information about this older person. Would you fill out the family and friends interview while I go interview the older gentleman? So on the financial decision tracker, he found lots of deficits for the older adult who didn't understand the impact this was having or the risk that he was taking. And of course, the informant presented this very glowing picture of how well this man was doing, but the daughters had given a report that was so much more similar to what the APS worker found with the older person. They were able to share this with the prosecutor and the police. They were able to use this in court, and it was very helpful in making the case, and she was found guilty. So let's put it all together. The FVS, the Financial Vulnerability Survey, really gives insight into the context of the financial situation. What are the general stressors financially? Are they psychological, relationship, or financial strain types of stressors? The FDT, the 10-item scale, assesses informed decision-making. And informed decision-making is often at the heart of these things. You walk up to the door, the older person answers it. You say, well, I've got a complaint here. Somebody thinks, your new friend is taking your money. And the older person says, well, that's because I want to give it to her. And the professional says, well, okay, he wants to do it. And so there's no exploitation. But that choice is not the only measure of informed decision-making. You have to have all four elements, and that's what the FDT provides. And the FFI assesses the informant or caregiver perspective. So I hope I've given you some encouragement. Take a look at our website, take a look at our tools. And all of those, by the way, this first question I always get asked, all the training, certification, use of our tools, use of our website comes at no charge to you. We've been very fortunate to be supported by grants and philanthropy. So our concern is for the older person and not the business model. Let me stop there. And let's go and have some good conversation about things. Should I stop the share, Rand?
Sure, if you'd like to, that would be fine. We haven't had anybody post questions yet, but I have just a couple that I was just thinking about during your presentation. So the training that you're just mentioning and these tools, and I know you talk about adult protective services, which is a US focus. And these tools, just to let people know that these tools are adaptable in the Canadian context, because I think sometimes people may not understand that in terms of being evidence-based and using it in courts, because I know that we do have justice involved on our participants today too.
Very much so, and they're not just for adult protective service workers. We have psychologists, social workers, physician practices, and financial professionals that also, as well as a few attorneys, that also have gone on, gotten trained, certified, use these tools.
There's just a question there. Has there been successful charges in financial abuse cases using this tool, and how does it hold up in court?
Holds up well. Yes, there have been. I use it, and I testify in court on cases. It holds up well. There's a good scientific basis for it. And so that helps, of course, if you ever are questioned about, well, what is this set of questions? Well, here's the validity and reliability of the tool. There's a lot of support for that empirically. But number two, that informed decision-making is really kind of a worldwide phenomenon. It's linked to most of the legal standards, especially in North America, whether it's Canada or the US. If you look at the wording for creating a will, do you understand the nature and effect of what you're doing? For entering into a contract, do you understand the property and the nature and effect of signing a document? If you're giving a gift, if you're making a donation, if you're executing a deed, that's what this is all about. And so it links very closely to the legal standard. So even if it wasn't empirically based, you'd be testifying about the same kind of thing. And so you have it two ways one, you've got a tool that's validated. Two, it really is linking to the exact questions that are in the legal standards. If you are going to use the tools and testify about them, it is important to familiarize yourself with the research that's been done. And you can do that on our website. You go to the resource page and you'll see all of our publications there. And you can take a look at those and really get yourself well-versed in that.
Great, thanks. And we have, just after the session ends, people can go back to link on Peter's speaker platform, and we have, or even under the session, and we posted the link to the Egg Nest website onto, so it's easy for people to find after the session. So you will be able to get that. And the PowerPoint as well, because I know there's some really good information that was posted. I did like the idea of when you showed sort of the questions and how it related to the context of that vulnerability, whether that's related to appreciation or their understanding, because I think sometimes we're not sure which question, why we're asking that question. So I think that's really good in terms of understanding that. There was a question related, just asking for some clarity. Did you indicate that there's not necessarily a correlation between financial literacy and financial exploitation vulnerability?
Yes, I did. So there's not a correlation between a score on our financial vulnerability survey and a score on the financial literacy. They were both related to whether somebody had been exploited or not. So there's two separate factors. And I think what it shows is our scale, the financial vulnerability survey, that part of it it's not the intellectual factor component that you think of with financial literacy. If we use the 10-item scale, we might find something very different. They'd probably be very related. But it's good to know that vulnerability and financial literacy, they're two separate issues that really do impact on people's susceptibility to exploitation.
I guess the other question is similar to, like from your perspective and use in the United States, do you find also, like here we find a lot of misuse of powers of attorney. Do you find the same thing when you're using that tool in your context within your country as well? Or has it even been adaptable in Canada, or do you know people in Canada that are using this? I know you mentioned before that you had done a presentation in Manitoba a few years back, or not too long ago. So I'm just wondering if you've had any feedback from other jurisdictions.
So there's two issues there. And one, my dear elder law attorney friend who has a very pessimistic view of the world says, well, Peter, I don't want this tool to get out there because people will misuse it. And they'll use it fraudulently and claim that they have support for something that they don't. Well, of course, people are going to commit fraud. They're going to commit fraud, and they're going to figure out a way to do that. We don't know how people have used it in terms of powers of attorney. We don't have people signing up and telling us that they're a power of attorney. They give us their profession, but they don't tell us that they're a power of attorney. So we don't really know the answer to that question. But it's a good question. And as I mentioned, and I mentioned it very specifically in the introduction, is that when fiduciaries misbehave and steal from their older clients, it's the worst. It's not only the betrayal of incredible trust, but they take the largest amount of money. And elder mistreatment impacts an older person more than just a identity theft or even a scam by a stranger on the whole. We just finished a study in which we saw you knew the person, you trusted the person, the effect on your level of depression, anxiety, vulnerability, and the amount of money you lost was double than if you didn't. Now, of course, we all know about stranger scams in which people lose a ton of money, but those are fairly rare, and there's a lot more scams that go on that are below the $5,000 level. And so those are important, though. They really do impact people.
Yeah. And do you know like what documents are needed to freeze bank accounts in an investigation? Like would these tools be used in that context?
I doubt they'd be used to freeze the account. In Michigan, for example, they just passed the Financial Exploitation Prevention Act, September 2021, I believe. Yep. It went into effect. And basically it gives banks the power and authority to stop the transaction until it's investigated and to refer to Adult Protective Services and not do anything else. But also, I do a lot of training for the credit unions here. And we talk to them about, well, okay, in talking with the older person, what are you trying to do? And we have on our website trainings for family and friends or caregivers. And one of those is about difficult conversations. And you have to be very gentle and take your time when talking to an older person about a decision that you are worried about that they're making, because they can easily get defensive.
Mm-hmm. In terms of just getting back to the use of the tools in the justice sector, are you aware of any successful convictions of using the tools in Canada? And are they permitted in our courts, or is there any restrictions in that in terms of using these in provincial courts?
I'm not aware. I just don't know.
So something we can look into. Let's see the one question. Oh, there was some funny, just clarifying. So in the States, there's adult protective service workers. We have a similar acronym here in Ontario, but those workers work specifically with those with developmental disabilities. So don't have the same support. So just providing some clarification for that for everybody. The last question. So when capacity is unclear, but there is a common concern around capacity, and there's a concern about the possible financial abuse, what would be the next step? Would the person require a formal capacity assessment? And if so, like how would that be attained in a timely manner? Now, I know that's a
yeah. So this is a first step in really detecting some of the informed decision-making deficits, but it's a screening process. And you'd want to know broader whether there are any neurocognitive problems or serious mental health problems that are also in play here, and how they're impacting the decision-making and how all of that integrates with the legal standards. So you would have to work with a professional that does that.
Okay.
Now, there's a great question in the chat.
Yes, I just noticed that.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Is the financial vulnerability survey the same thing as the financial vulnerability assessment on our website? No. Unfortunately, the names are so close. One's the FVA, one's the FVS. So the FVS and the FVS Pro are what I talked about, the 17 items, vulnerability skill. The financial vulnerability assessment is really used for as part of a capacity assessment. It does integrate context and decision-making, but also you can pretty much do that with FVS and the 10-item scale, but this sort of takes it all together and has a couple of other different items, obviously 34 items, not 27, and gives you a total score and some concerns. But anybody who feels like they are skilled at working with older people who have financial exploitation or financial decision-making can go ahead and take the training and certification for the financial vulnerability assessment. I know that several of our APS workers have migrated to that. They really like that a lot.
Thank you for that clarification. I know sometimes when I think that the training piece for I know a couple of the sessions today, just talking about, I think everyone's been talking about the importance of that training, just to sort of understand why we're using it, how it's used. So if you are going to use it, let's say in a court system, or going to a bank or financial institution to say, this is what I found using this tool, is to have that understanding about why the questions are being asked and what the answers mean, so they can be, given that explanation back to the individual, to validate the importance or the financial vulnerability of that person. So going online to do the training, I think that's the one thing, is all this training is available on your website to do that. And perhaps we can engage you in other discussions to do maybe more specific training to walk people through that, maybe in the next couple months or something like that, based on people's interest in getting a little bit more familiar with some of these tools, because I think there's some great use of this, especially when we see such an increase of financial exploitation to older adults within Canada, not only within Ontario, but beyond the different jurisdictions. And we don't have a lot of tools that we have been using, I think, in terms of financial, specifically, that vulnerability that could be used in other training and contexts within specific even sectors or disciplines, including like justice and somebody about healthcare. So
yeah, and what I want to address the last comment in the chat, but before I do, I want to say that these tools are created in a way to help elicit the older person's story. We really need to take our time and understand from the older person's perspective what it is they see and think about this situation before we go in and protect them. And think, many times we do need to do that, but we really need to understand it so that we can then help them to understand it as well. And these kind of talking through some of these tools, question more conversationally, can help that. Somebody put something in the chat about kind of financial planning and signing a document to a trusted advocate in case the planner observes cognitive decline. And I think that's always an excellent idea. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, that was a change in legislation, or change in, not legislation, but change within the Ontario Securities Commission. They kind of implemented that for people who are, let's say, capacity is diminished and they're worried about, the POA or another designate, maybe on joint ownership, sort of taking advantage of someone. So if they're concerned that if they can't get a hold of that person, they can talk to say, did you know this is going on, kind of thing, just to validate, to make sure to minimize any misuse of someone's funds in that kind of context. So yeah, it is a good resource. So we are at our end of time. Thank you so much, Peter, for joining us. We do appreciate you taking the time. I know you're a busy person. And we, if anybody wants more information, please just check out the session. We will be posting this recording as well as a PowerPoint. Give us a couple days to post that up on the website. Again, you can go back to that portal and access some of the materials that we've been sharing here today. So thank you again, Peter. We have a 5-minute break and we'll be beginning just at 2:05 for our next session. So thank you again, Peter.
Thank you.